Hey folks, welcome back to Exposure Points. I'm your host, Stuart Day, and today I want to peel back the narrative of the natural gas boom in Appalachia. You've heard the promises before: jobs, prosperity, booming towns. For more than a decade, politicians and industry leaders have painted a picture of transformation, telling people this boom would change everything. They said it would be the economic game changer that could resurrect abandoned steel towns and revive rural communities that had lost their agricultural base. It would save family farms and bring millions in tax revenues to schools and local governments across the region. It sounded like the start of a new golden era for Appalachia. So what have we learned in that time? What did these communities gain and what did they lose in the process? By now, you'd think we could point to town after town that has been revived, places that are economically flourishing. We should be able to look at clear metrics showing the salvation of the Ohio River Valley. And considering that natural gas development in Appalachia has generated well over $500 billion in revenue since the late 2000s, you'd expect this region to resemble the Saudi Arabia of the United States. But that's not really what we see at all. By the end of this episode, I want you to see not only what the numbers say, but why they don't match the story people were promised and continue to believe in. Before we dive in, I just want to remind you, Exposure is independent journalism. We don't take money from industry and we have no political ties. If you would like to help keep this work alive, you can support us at exposurestudios.org. At the end of the day, we all deserve to know what's happening in our communities and the hidden costs of these industries. Back in the early 2000s, politicians in Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia were making bold promises about what shale gas would mean. Former Pennsylvania Governor Ed Rendell told reporters in 2010 the Marcellus Shale could be the second coming of the Industrial Revolution and would revitalize the state's economy. Ohio Governor John Kasich said at an energy conference in 2011, he predicted shale development would make Eastern Ohio an economic powerhouse and said it could create tens of thousands of jobs. And West Virginia Governor Earl Ray Tomblin, in his 2012 State of the State address, assured residents that natural gas development would provide a bright future for West Virginia families. Those were the headlines, and they set the stage for what people expected. Thousands of jobs, economic revitalization, big royalty checks, stronger local tax bases. Since 2008, analysts estimate the natural gas industry has generated more than $500 billion in total market value across Appalachia, an extraordinary sum on paper, yet one that has done far less for local communities than many were led to believe. In Pennsylvania, shale gas production throws off flashy numbers. Industry reports talk about tens of billions in market value each year, but the Ohio River Valley Institute has shown repeatedly that these dollars barely touch local communities. Less than 10 cents of every gas dollar goes to labor, and the sector supports only about 20,000 jobs statewide. Despite production growth that pushed GDP up on paper in drilling counties, Orvie found that incomes, jobs, and populations all stagnated or declined. In other words, most of the money is flowing straight out of the state to corporate headquarters, out-of-state workers, equipment suppliers, leaving only a thin sliver of benefit for Pennsylvania. By contrast, industries built into the fabric of Pennsylvania communities capture and circulate far more of their revenue locally. To put it plainly, while gas extraction may dazzle with big top-line sales, it leaves behind only pennies on the dollar, whereas manufacturing, farming, and healthcare keep the bulk of their earnings circulating in Pennsylvania towns, paychecks, and tax bases. So let's look at what the data actually shows. Drawing on reports from the Ohio River Valley Institute and other sources, when we focus on the 30 or so top gas-producing counties across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia, what Orvie calls Frackalachia, one thing jumps out. Economic output, or GDP, has grown significantly. On paper, the region looks like it's booming. But when you look past GDP, the story flips. Despite all that growth, jobs in these counties actually fell by about 1%, while nationally, jobs grew by more than 14% during the same period. Population has declined by roughly 3% since the boom started, in these counties, and the local labor force has shrunk. Income growth has lagged well behind the national average, meaning families here haven't seen the same rise in prosperity as most Americans. Even within the region, there are disparities. A few Pennsylvania counties managed to keep jobs relatively steady, but still lost population. And in Ohio, the eastern fracking counties lost more than 8% of their jobs, and many saw population losses above 5%. West Virginia's fracking counties performed a bit better than the state average on some metrics, but they still fell far short of national trends, and many lost residents as well. So here's the paradox. GDP shoots up because of resources being extracted and monetized, but those gains don't translate into healthier, more economically stable communities. The jobs created are fewer than promised, often temporary, and in many cases filled by out-of-state transient workers. The boom is followed by Main Street busts. We don't see income rises. Areas burdened by poverty before the boom remain burdened by poverty after, and that's unusual. In economics, when GDP rises, we normally expect jobs, population, and income to rise as well. Here, the opposite happens. That rare divergence is the signal that we need to pay attention to. And it's the perfect launching point for the next part of the story, why this disconnect exists in the first place. But before we jump to that, I just want to say on top of all of this, there's another issue that needs paying attention to, and that's the costs. The costs are very real. Extra wear and tear on roads and infrastructure, public health impacts, environmental damage, contamination of water sources and soil. Some studies have suggested that communities near intensive drilling have experienced higher rates of crime, drug use, and sexually transmitted diseases. None of these burdens show up in the glossy economic reports touted by industry and politicians, focused only on that shining, rising GDP. But these costs weigh heavily on the people and communities forced to live with those consequences. So why does this happen? How can GDP soar while jobs, population, and incomes fall? The answer lies in the structure of the industry and the way the deals were struck. Most of the profits flow outward to corporate headquarters, to outside landowners, to investors who live far from drilling sites. The equipment, the capital, even much of the workforce is imported, so very little of the money stays rooted in the local economy. It's not unlike what happens when big chain retailers move into a town. They push out local businesses, and the dollars you spend at those chains don't circulate locally. They get funneled back to distant corporate offices. Over time, that hollows out the local economy. The gas industry works in a very similar way. The vast majority of the money generated here flows out of the community and often out of the state entirely. The other issue with fracking is that it is a boom-bust cycle. So when the industry moves into an area, there's this huge flourishing of economic activity. That's the boom. And when that boom happens, you see small businesses who are suddenly flooded with more customers because of all the out-of-state activity. They increase their capacity. They hire more employees. They increase their equipment or their space. You see a lot of landlords raise their rents, which then prices out a lot of the locals, which have to kind of move out of the area then. But then when the bust comes, it's like the bottom gets pulled out from all of that. So all those businesses that increase their capacity to meet this demand caused by the boom now are over leveraged. And all of these landlords who raise their prices now lose all of their tenants. And a lot of the locals that would have been there otherwise have kind of been pushed out of the area because they don't want to be around it. They can't afford the rents anymore. And so you lose a lot of, particularly like young people who would be renting instead of owning homes. You lose a lot of that in the process. And this happens over and over again. And so it goes to one town and then the next town and the next town. So it creates these little temporary economic bubbles that are very harmful when they burst. Then there's the policy side. From the start, lobbying and weak regulations tilted the playing field towards industry. Policy analysts note that Pennsylvania never adopted a severance tax, while Ohio and West Virginia kept their rates comparatively low. Local officials with limited staff and expertise often faced well-paid corporate lobbyists writing the rules. Communities had little leverage. This further hollowed out local economies. Policymakers bought into the idea that the industry would generate a huge number of jobs, which it really hasn't, and made concessions to entice companies to come. But the truth is, companies weren't following incentives, they were following the resources. In practice, critics contend policymakers ended up giving away a lot of money based on a poor understanding of how this industry actually works. Or maybe they understood it perfectly. The promise of spillover growth never came. That is the structural mismatch. The extraction machine is built to generate GDP and shareholder returns, not to build lasting, broad-based prosperity for the people living in the communities where extraction is happening. At this point, the natural question people all over Appalachia should be asking themselves is, where is our money? Why are our schools, our hospitals, and our roads still underfunded despite all the drilling around us? Why are we still living in impoverished areas despite these companies claiming to have generated billions of dollars extracting the resources from beneath our feet? And what exactly were our politicians doing while this was all happening? It feels a lot like walking into your house after a break-in. Drawers are empty, the valuables are gone, and you're left with the damage. That's the experience of many communities across Appalachia. Massive value extraction, but little left behind and a long list of problems that they now have to deal with. And this isn't unique here. I mean, it mirrors a pattern we've seen all over the world for decades. Corporations moving in to tap natural resources, governments negotiating lopsided deals, often with a fair bit of corruption, and the wealth flowing outward while the social and environmental costs stay local. Appalachia has been treated in much the same way, as a sacrifice zone. And when you look at the role of local and state politicians, the picture doesn't get much better. Their job is supposed to be to negotiate on behalf of their constituents. Yet time and again, they failed to capture real value for the people who live here. Maybe it was a lack of capacity or understanding. Maybe it was being overwhelmed by the influence of corporate money, or maybe it was both. Either way, the result is the same. Appalachia communities have once again been left shouldering the costs while industries generated billions of dollars in their backyards, leaving behind very little of that prosperity. So what's the path forward? Well, I think it really starts with having a serious conversation about how we define and govern natural resources. Traditionally, the idea of private mineral rights made some sense because the resources were vertical. But modern fracking, and many of the greenwash solutions as well, are different. Wells can run laterally for miles underground, and the impacts, the radioactive waste, the fugitive VOC emissions, the groundwater contamination, they don't stay neatly within property lines. That reality calls for a more societal-wide interpretation of resource ownership and value, one that balances private landowner rights to capitalize on their property, but doesn't shoulder the costs onto the public. First, the laws need changed. Landmen, the agents who convince people to sign leases, should be held to at least the same fiduciary and legal standards as realtors. In fact, given the complexity and stakes of these deals, they should be held to even higher standards. Transparency and standardization of lease agreements are essential, eliminating predatory carve-outs and making sure payouts are crystal clear. Second, subsidies and giveaways have to end. This is one of the most powerful, lucrative industries on earth. There's no justification for showering them with tax credits, subsidies, or public handouts. Those resources should instead be invested in diversifying local economies, supporting clean energy, small businesses, infrastructure, health, regenerative agriculture, and education. Third, communities must be compensated for the true cost. Infrastructure wear and tear, public health burdens, environmental degradation, these aren't incidentals. They're core costs of the industry. Bonding requirements should be applied across the board, scaled for inflation, and designed to actually cover disaster cleanup and long-term damages. And regulators must be equipped with teeth. That means better funding and insulating the agencies like the DEP so they can serve the public interest rather than corporate priorities. Fourth, data collection and research need to be paramount. It is unacceptable that after nearly 2 decades of shale development, we still have such limited public data on VOC emissions, the chemical composition of brine and drill cuttings, and the scope of the radioactive issue. Fence line air monitoring should be required at all sites. All waste exemptions should be rescinded, and oil and gas waste should be treated as the hazardous material it truly is. That includes taking better care of workers, truck drivers, and contractors, ensuring they are paid fairly, properly trained, and are given adequate protective equipment. Fifth, the basic structural safeguards must be strengthened. Setbacks should be expanded so that drilling and processing and waste facilities are kept away from schools, daycares, hospitals, and homes. Communities should also have the right to say no without fear of being overruled by higher levels of government or crushed under industry lawsuits. Sixth, the state and federal governments must end the practice of abandonment and bankruptcy that allows these companies to walk away from their responsibilities. Far too often, operators use shell companies to declare bankruptcy, dodging the cost of properly decommissioning wells, leaving them to be orphaned, the tab falling on the taxpayers. In Pennsylvania alone, there are nearly 150,000 abandoned gas wells, an absolutely unacceptable burden on the public. This has to end. The industry must be held accountable for abandoning wells and required to pay for their decommissioning and capping, not leaving communities to foot the bill. Finally, we need to focus on keeping value local. Wealth from extraction should not simply funnel outward. Mechanisms like community benefit agreements, revenue sharing, and stricter royalty protections are ways to ensure that communities see more than pennies on the dollar. None of this will happen without pressure from below. Organizing, awareness, and persistence are the only ways communities can shift the balance of power and claim a fair share of the value that's being taken from them for far too long. We need diversification. Real prosperity won't come from doubling down on extraction. It will come from investing in clean energy, small businesses, local infrastructure, healthcare, and schools. We need vision. Accountability matters too. Health studies, environmental audits, and real regulatory enforcement can help capture some of these true costs, rather than leaving them hidden. And finally, none of this will happen without community awareness. Communities speaking up, demanding better terms, putting pressure on leaders and the press. That's how balance of power shifts. But that starts with educating the public on what's really going on. The story of the natural gas boom is straightforward on the surface. Massive extraction, soaring GDP, headlines about growth. Politicians across the spectrum have often supported fracking, while framing it differently in different contexts to appease environmentalists or industry loyalists. They love it because they can tout the pipeline project or the processing plant or the fracking wells as economic growth. Those on the right lean into the whole "we're saving farms in our Rust Belt rural economies" narrative. And those on the left can lean into the "it's cleaner than coal, it's a bridge fuel to get us out of dirtier fuels" narrative. It is an industry that has served both Democrats and Republicans well. But for the people living in Frackalachia, the realities have been very different. Job losses, population declines, stagnant incomes, and a heavy, heavy toll on public health and the environment. The problem is it's very difficult for people in these areas to make the connection between those felt losses and hardships and fracking. It's hard for them to see past the curated illusion of growth. That's why the work of groups like the Ohio River Valley Institute are so important, because their work cuts through the smoke. It lays the reality bare using the industry and government's own published data. So the question is not whether we got what was promised. The answer to that is abundantly clear to anyone who's paying attention. The real question is what we want going forward, because with data centers on the horizon, we're looking at another natural gas boom that may dwarf the original. And who is going to hold the brokers, the politicians, and the companies to account? Because if no one does, the pattern will simply repeat. Once again, I pointed out in the last episode that environmentalists have consistently been more accurate than their opponents on these broad brush issues. Think back to fights over the Keystone pipeline. At the time, industry leaders and politicians insisted these pipelines would not leak, dismissing repeated warnings from environmental advocates. So who was right? Keystone suffered major spills in 2017, 2019, and again in 2022, with one of the largest inland oil spills in U.S. history in Kansas. Communities near these projects have documented water contamination, and federal review acknowledged the spill risks all along. Environmentalists warned about the leaks, soil and water contamination, and health impacts from fugitive emissions, and time has shown those warnings to be correct. So my final word today is this. You don't have to be against the industry or call for banning it to recognize the obvious discrepancy between what was promised and what has been delivered. You don't have to be an anti-fracking environmentalist to admit that environmentalists raised valid concerns. And you don't have to dislike oil and gas workers to insist that their communities, landowners, schools, farmers, and them deserve fair compensation for the immense value being pulled from beneath their feet. They should not be left paying the externalized costs of an industry that year after year earns more revenue than many of the counties it operates in combined. That's it for today's exposure points. If this work matters to you, you want to get involved, share these conversations, subscribe, or support us at exposurestudios.org. Every dollar helps us shine light where industry wants darkness, and every share expands our reach. You can also check out our long-form interviews and conversations on Exposure, where my co-host Jill Hunkler and I talk with experts and impacted community members. These industries have built a model of offloading their costs onto us, our health, our water, our soil, through financial schemes that drain our tax dollars. With your help, we'll keep exposing these stories. I'm Stuart Day. This has been Exposure Points. Thanks for being with me, and I'll see you next week.